But tonight, Mike Wesley-Smith, you have a similar story that is in fact almost 37 years old.
Yes, John, this is probably a story most of the audience has never even heard of. It's a flight called ZK-EBU, a scenic charter flight that was last seen heading out towards the coast of the Milford Sound. 7 people on board.
Incredible.
Who simply vanished without a trace. I came across this story visiting a website called findlostaircraft.co.nz, which is essentially a labour of love for an amateur investigator called Gavin. And his website's a wealth of information for aircraft that have gone missing in and around New Zealand.
And so that's some of them behind us here. In total, how many aircraft does Gavin believe we've lost? Because we seem to be very good at this, sadly.
Yes, well, based on Gavin's research, he reckons about 12 aircraft with about 29 souls on board that took off on different dates throughout the 20th century and have simply never been seen since. But this is just the story of one, ZK-EBU, which we're going to bring you tonight.
The west coast of the South Island. A vast expanse that in places can be simply still and also untamed. A wilderness where mysteries linger.
It can just hold all its secrets.
Secrets including people long since lost.
Amongst them is seen as a scenic charter flight, call sign ZK-EBU, a plane that was carrying 7 people on board when it vanished without a trace in 1978. It's a mystery that's haunted the families of those on board for almost 4 decades.
The awful bit of it is imagining, you know, the terror they might have experienced before the plane went down wherever it landed.
In all the years, you never forget and you always wonder, and the pain never goes away of losing anybody like that.
It still haunts me to this day. The fact that if the search had been focused in that area, I mean, who knows? There could have been survivors, who knows?
The big worry is if the story dies, people stop looking, and so we try and keep the story alive.
That story has its beginnings on a Dunedin morning on the 29th of December 1978. 6 people, 5 of them family, arranged to charter a plane from Dunedin to Hokitika to see a relative.
They were both really ordinary, hard-working, working-class folks.
Amongst them, husband and wife Alec and Rose Stewart, parents of 4 children. Coral was their eldest.
Dad was a typical father of the day, worked hard in his job and then spent the evenings restoring his vintage car in the garage. Mum worked on the weekends. She was an at-home mum but worked on weekends as a cook in a maternity hospital.
The flight was to be her parents' first. It made the then 17-year-old Coral nervous, a feeling she shared with her mum.
I said to her, I don't really want you to go on this plane. You know, why do you have to go? And she said, oh, it'll be all right. You know, we've never done anything exciting like that before.
Also on the passenger list, Coral's uncle Pete Stewart, his wife Elizabeth, their 18-year-old son David, and his friend David Hogg, who was 21. Edward Morrison was the 28-year-old pilot. His sister Barbara remembers her brother as someone who wanted to be airborne from an early age.
His passion was flying. He loved it. Yeah, right from a boy when we were growing up as young kids, he always loved planes and anything to do with flight. Well, this photo here is when my brother graduated from the Otago University with his son.
Edward was regarded as a capable and experienced pilot, having clocked up almost 1,500 hours in the air. He worked as an instructor at the Otago Aero Club. Barbara still has Edward's flying logbook. He never had the chance to fill in the details of his last trip.
He didn't take risks. He had really good qualifications and he had worked really hard to get those qualifications.
Early on the morning of that fateful flight, Edward met his passengers at Taieri Airfield for the trip to Hokitika. But prior to takeoff, they struck a problem. The weather had closed in at Hokitika, meaning a trip there wasn't possible.
So I thought, well, since we've got the pilot, why don't we go and have a scenic flight, which is what they plan to do.
Edward identified himself to air traffic control and told them of his new flight plan. We have recreated these radio communications based on actual transcripts.
Going over here Queenstown, Milford Sound right down at Preservation Inlet and then direct line to Taieri.
The journey was estimated to take around 3.5 hours, and there was enough fuel on board for 5 hours flying time.
Well, the very last memory is actually driving them out to the Taieri aerodrome and dropping them off for their flight, and actually watching them fly off, and then driving home. And I remember making a sort of a shepherd's pie thing, thinking, oh, I'll make that for when they come back. And of course they never came back to eat it.
Dunedin Tower, EBU over.
EBU Dunedin.
EBU Airborne Taieri proceeding as per flight plan.
From there, everything proceeded as normal. EBU reported in at Queenstown at 10:49 a.m. By 11:30, EBU had entered Milford Sound.
Are you on a flight plan?
Affirmative.
What is your next reporting point and estimate?
Preservation Inlet in approximately 1 hour. We'll call in for Cargill Tower, 118.5 at 12:25.
What is the weather on the coast?
The cloud is down to 500 feet from 20 miles north of the Sound up to the mouth of the Sound.
At 11:38 a.m, the aircraft again reported overhead of Milford, having flown to nearby Sutherland Falls and back. They were then seen travelling towards the entrance to the Sound. It would be the last confirmed sighting of EBU. Repeated attempts to contact the plane were met with radio silence. Within hours, searchers were scrambled and the families were told the news the plane was overdue.
Well, I remember feeling really frightened and sort of really not believing it. Actually, I feel quite nervous actually reflecting back on that. And then it was just a matter of waiting.
My brother Peter and Mum had told me about the accident, that he was missing, and it just seemed unbelievable, really.
There was no emergency located beacon ever heard, so that didn't look good for a start.
John von Tunzelman was a spotter on board one of the search aircraft.
We just come and park by the lake.
Early on, it was apparent the task of finding EBU would be no easy feat. Firstly, the search area was immense, stretching from the bottom of the South Island as far north as Haast.
You think of Fiordland National Park, it's 1.2 million hectares or 3.5 million acres of wilderness, and most of it's forested. And if an aircraft goes through the canopy, if it breaks up in flight in little pieces, unless somebody stumbles across it, it could be there forever.
Despite the challenges, searchers pressed on. John's crew scoured areas south of Milford Sound in very difficult weather conditions.
We flew low and slow down the coast, the idea being that if the thing had impacted into the sea, we might find some wheels, might find some flying surfaces that often have air trapped in them, seat cushions, personal effects of people washed up on the shore.
But after 4 days of fruitless searching, the difficult decision was made to call the operation off.
The hardest thing was coming into the flare back to the hangar just on dark or sometimes after dark and seeing all these faces looking up at you. Have you found them? And before skids on the ground, and they know without a word being spoken that you haven't found the thing. So that's stuff you think about that,
They basically said, oh, just letting you know that the search has been called off. Terribly shocking.
And just like that, an aircraft in apparent good working order, with 7 souls on board, was gone. All will be presumed dead. Investigators will conclude the probable cause of the accident could not be determined, but bad weather conditions were likely to have been a factor in the accident. For over 30 years, the mystery of EBU and her passengers slowly faded from public view, existing mostly in the memories of those left behind and yellowy newspapers stored away in shoeboxes. That was until
I went into my computer and just put in missing in Fiordland, planes missing in Fiordland, and came up with Gavin's research.
Gavin is Gavin Grimmer, an amateur missing aircraft investigator.
I should be right.
A recreational pilot since 1982. Gavin loves planes.
Clear, prop.
What does your wife think of you guys living on an airfield next to a hangar?
Well, I think she loves it actually, but she probably likes it better than I do. So.
From his small office just off his hangar in Hastings, Gavin spends his days trying to locate lost aircraft. It's a passion, something he does without pay for hundreds of hours a year, driven by a desire to help families of the missing.
There's nothing worse for them than knowing that everyone's just sort of forgotten them, you know, and it was as though their loved ones weren't important, you know.
And indeed, there are many people whose loved ones never came home. Based on his research, Gavin believes there could be as many as 12 aircraft that have crashed at places unknown in New Zealand. They took with them a total of 29 people. It's a list that includes EBU, a case Gavin studied for the last 2 years.
EBU, I believe, is up just in that area there, Lake Cherokee.
A belief based on an intriguing witness account from the very evening EBU disappeared. Lake Cherokee is a remote spot located around 30 kilometres north of Haast. It wasn't an area covered in the original search, and it was there a west coaster made a possible sighting of EBU.
By now it was 6 p.m. in the evening and darkness was falling here at the mouth of the Cherokee River. And in drizzly conditions like this, local woman Jenny Barratt and her husband were putting out cray pots when Jenny turned and saw something completely unexpected, an aircraft flying over the top of her at treetop level.
This plane just came out of nowhere from the land and went out to sea for a little way and circled round and then came back and flew directly over the top of me and then just disappeared in the rain and the cloud. I just immediately thought, he's lost.
Jenny is a qualified glider pilot from an aviation family. She only learned of the disappearance a couple of days later, when she read her local newspaper and saw a picture of EBU on the front page.
I said to my husband, that's the aircraft that I saw fly over a couple of nights back. And he said, how sure are you? And I said, I'm pretty certain.
Jenny contacted local police, but she later learned the sighting was discounted as it wasn't where EBU was believed to be. There is no mention of her account in the final aircraft accident report.
I was quite concerned that nobody had followed up because it wasn't just a flight of fancy, if you like. You know, I did, as I say, I did have a background of aviation.
To what extent do we know that it could have been another aircraft in the area?
Oh, probably nil. I mean, there's not that many airplanes flying around there, especially not Beechcraft Barons or Cherokee 6s. And at 100 foot off the deck, I mean, it was obviously a day that probably the birds weren't flying, you know.
Remember, much of the original search area was focused south of Milford Sound along EBU's stated course towards Preservation Inlet. The idea that it ended up much further north up the coast over the Morrison River raises a number of questions. Firstly, why had EBU changed the direction of its flight path?
A weather report from a fishing boat at the mouth of George Sound indicated the weather south of Milford was bad at the time EBU disappeared. There was low cloud and visibility.
Being a pilot and knowing that he had 6 people sitting behind him that he was responsible for, there was no way on earth he would have continued. He would have turned around and went north.
According to Gavin's theory, the plane has travelled into the Kaipo Valley, mistaking it for the entrance to the Hollyford Valley, the usual route back to the Taieri airfield. A hunting party in the Kaipo Valley later reported hearing an aircraft engine. Gavin says there was some uncertainty amongst the searchers as to when the plane was actually heard.
It was heard there at 12:20, and they thought maybe it was 11:20 because they were trying to. Their belief was that it had gone south. Now, which meant it couldn't have been heard at 12:20 if it went south.
The next question is this. EBU's known fuel load meant it would have run out of fuel mid-afternoon on the 29th of December 1978. So how could it have still been flying when Jenny Barratt saw it at 6 p.m. that evening?
Unable to go through the Hollyford Valley due to heavy cloud, Gavin believes EBU landed somewhere. One possibility is a deserted airstrip operated by a mining company near the Gorge River, a location outside of radio range.
He would have been easily able to see that. I think he landed there, waited out most of the day, and then as it was getting on evening, of course, he needed to keep moving. He's got to try and get these passengers to a place where they can sleep for the night.
This had been the right place for the helicopter to look down.
Tom McCready, a former investigator for the Civil Aviation Authority, has analysed Gavin's findings. He says it's conceivable EBU landed at the airstrip.
And you're running out of good ideas, and it just gets more and more stressful, and it just builds up, and you start getting a bit of tunnel vision and get a bit panicky.
Under pressure to get his passengers to safety and out of radio range, Gavin believes EBU took off again in the late afternoon, heading north to get to the airfield at Hokitika or even Greymouth. Still between layers of cloud and desperate to find the coast, Gavin says the plane descended through a hole in the clouds over Lake Moraki. Due to changes in air temperature, gaps in clouds are known to form over large bodies of water such as lakes. After its descent, EBU has then headed to the coast where it's been seen by Jenny Barratt.
What happened to the plane that Jenny Barratt saw, if indeed it was EBU, isn't certain. One possibility is that it came up the Moraki River and crashed somewhere on the northeastern side of the river, which is here behind me. That was the focus of some past land searches and will be the focus of any future land search that takes place.
Local pilot Blair Hoult lives near Moraki River on an old airstrip. He believes it may have been visible to Edward Morrison back on the 29th of December 1978.
He could have come past the mouth of Wakapohoi, seen the strip, and if he wanted to get down, he would have. You would have come down the Moraki River, because with that weather you'd have a northerly, and so he would have gone down the Moraki over Jenny and down here.
Tom McCready says while witness accounts aren't always reliable, those like Jenny's are worth a second look.
It's very difficult to say, well, that account's rubbish and that one's good or whatever. You should never go there. Unless you have any other bright idea, go and have a look at what she said. She might be dead right.
Mike Wesley-Smith, this is an incredible story. What official efforts have been made to find this plane?
Well, essentially none since 1979 when the original effort ended, and that basically it comes down to the expense and resources that would be involved in conducting a search. We contacted official search agencies here, and they basically say they don't have any sufficiently reliable information to justify the expense that would be involved. That hasn't deterred Gavin, though. He did a search 2 years ago with a bunch of volunteers, and they're hoping to go back in April to search the Lake Moraki area. So there will be a search that goes on. It just will be rather small scale.
And I understand you're going to go with them, right? Let's compare, because I'm fascinated by the situation in Australia. We were talking about this before you came on here. So in New Zealand, 12 planes and 29 people missing, without trace, never found. What's the situation in Australia?
So in Australia, they have one civilian missing aircraft. Yep, it went missing in 1981. And that's been the subject of a lot of attention by both investigators over there and official agencies. Basically, official agencies have conducted searches every year for the last 16 to 17 years to try and find the aircraft. Still haven't found it, but they're still pressing on.
I guess it is fair to point out, and I know you would like to point out, that the terrain is very different. It is easier to find a missing plane in Australia. But nonetheless, 1 versus 12 is a hell of a difference. Right, what have you got for us after the break, Mike?
Well, coming up, we have a pretty special meeting between Barbara and Coral. They had previously neither met anyone who was else affected by the accident. So, yes, they met together at Barbara's home. But just on the question of expense, we did put this to Tom McCready, the former former CAA investigator, and he had a pretty interesting possible solution to how we can continue the search for EBU.
A lot of army and police exercises that go on that require their young officers to do a bit of logistics planning, and well, a search would be ideal for that. You know, it doesn't have to be a necessarily expensive carry-on.
It was on a summery afternoon that Barbara and Coral finally found each other after 36 years, meeting for the first time at Barbara's home in Wellington.
Hello.
Oh, Coral.
Nice to meet you.
Lovely to meet you after all these years.
I know.
Yeah, it really is.
It's almost like we have shared the most intimate life experience with all those losses, and yet we're sitting here perfect strangers.
Yes, yeah, exactly, yeah.
But after only a few minutes chatting, strangers became friends.
The other thing that struck me was too that we're actually both the eldest.
Yes.
And we're girls.
Yeah. You have responsibility tattooed over your forehead?
Possibly. Yeah, so
and they finally both got to meet Gavin,
relevant.
another perfect stranger trying to reunite them with their lost loved ones.
Way I go again. As you would have known, they left from Tyree there.
Yeah, I dropped them off.
The families don't doubt how difficult it will be to find EBU. 36 years of waiting tells them that. And Gavin's theory on its whereabouts remains simply a theory, believed by some and not by others.
And so he's got them all back on board and flown north.
I'd say there's a 50% chance these aircraft went in the ocean and nothing has ever been found of it. The other 50% would be that he's somewhere between the entrance to Milford Sound, St Anne's Point, and preservation on the coast in the forest.
Gavin, for his part, though, remains focused on the area around the Morrison River. And later this year, he will again be joined by other volunteers to search unexplored ground.
When you know people have got hope and you're giving them hope, it's sort of, you try and do your best.
Barbara and Coral's hope has for so long been stored away with those reminders in shoeboxes. What we do with hope is our own choice, but for Barbara and Coral, they've chosen to join Gavin's ground search, doing what they can to bring their family members home.
Oh, yeah, I would definitely love to go down there and search, yeah, on the ground.
It's like the long goodbye that never has a sense of finishing. So it would mean a tremendous amount to all of us, just to have a sense of knowing where they are, what happened to them.